everybody here? Our topic is women and anti-Semitism. This is a reference not to women who have experienced anti-Semitic bigotry. It refers to the experiencing of anti-Semitism as a woman, targeted ironically by other women, and from within a context where it would be least expected, at least on the face of it, namely from within the women's movement itself. This plenary, as we reach the conference conclusion, a conference that has been disturbing on so many levels, and yet I think has also been affirming on other levels for many of us. This plenary discusses a form of anti-Semitism that cuts across all of the perspectives we have heard. Its particularity derives from its very universality. If we consider the tremendous impact of feminist ideology on the world in which we live, if we attempt to grasp its incalculable influence on our collective outlook and on virtually every aspect of contemporary human interaction, one can then grasp the potential reach of the values and perspectives it spreads. Our speakers bring very different stories, but share important features. Each has been fully committed and identified activist within the feminist movement, fighting for its stated aims of equality and self-determination by fighting bias, bigotry, and double standards. Yet each experienced crushing disillusionment when faced with the bias and double standards which remained when it came to the Jewish movement of self-determination. When they found no room for their viewpoints within this, their ideological home, the situation forced a break. In some cases, it was an expulsion, manifested in their marginalization and ostracism. In others, it was an abrupt leave-taking with no looking back. And in other cases, in different attempts to negotiate the divide. We're truly fortunate to have women of such distinction and prolific accomplishment address us today. We're determined to stick to the time limit allotted to each speaker so that there remains ample time for discussion. I would just say that cumulatively, these stories form an allegory, and as such, they are a gripping cautionary tale. Each speaker will note the corrosive effects of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, anti-Israel and anti-Semitic attitudes on the feminist agenda and on the cause of women as well as Jews. Each one of them, in a different field, continues to argue for intellectual and moral honesty with respect to these issues. They will also note the heavy cost which resulted from taking a stand against the distortion of ideals to which they had been so fully committed. With today's accusations of Jew loyalty being leveled at Jews in America and elsewhere from some quarters, we do well to listen to their words and consider their implications. Thank you, Phyllis. I regret that Gloria Greenfield, whose name appears on the program, isn't able to be here today. Our next speaker is Thyme Siegel. In the late 1960s, researcher and activist Thyme Siegel initiated women's studies courses at the University of California in Berkeley. She was included in the encyclopedia Feminists Who Changed America in 2006. In 1970, Thyme Siegel became part of a matriarchal village composed of women only, an attempt at female utopia, providing an identity in a community suffused with a sense of female bonding and accomplishment. She has taught a variety of courses at the University of San Francisco, at Cabrillo College, California, SUNY New Paltz, and the School of Visual Arts in New York City. She has lectured and published articles on Jewish secular identity and anti-Semitism in progressive movements. Her published fiction appears in several anthologies of Jewish women writers. She comes to us from Berkeley, California, and her topic is Sisterhood Was Powerful and Global, Where Did It Go?
Hello, everybody. I've tossed like a dreamer through my life in America. Daughter of Yiddish speakers, daughter of the backwoods of New Jersey, I was sleepwalking, incubating, even though 20 years ago I researched and taught Jewish women's history and published an article called Anti-Jewish Oppression in Progressive Movements. I did not feel it. I didn't feel personally threatened. Am I too close? I did not have a sense of personal threat, except when I thought about Israel. I was afraid to go. Israel was too precious and too vulnerable. Finally, Pesach week, '09, I went to Israel. Enchanted, I wrote a story of my adventure called 3 Weeks in the Holy Land. It's the best story I've ever written. I loved my little Jewish nation, a whole country of my extended family. But when I arrived back in Northern California, old friends of the decades, people who were always warm and supportive of me and my writing, did not approve of my joy. They did not want to hear that I loved Israel, and they did not want to read my adventure. I went to dinner at the home of an old high school friend, a well-published Talmudic scholar, also considered a feminist for his writings. Even though he owes his career to Israel, he felt Israel had no right to defend itself against rockets from Hamas. His response to my questioning this was, "For a few rockets? It's lies, it's all lies." I said there were many, many reports of thousands of rockets. It's lies, it's all lies, he said. But I said, "But I know someone whose relatives have a half a second to get into a bomb shelter in Eshkelon." He shrugged contemptuously. He scoffs at the notion of contemporary anti-Semitism. He pooh-poohed the problem of Jews having to flee Europe, again, highly overblown, he says. He compared the Israelis to Nazis in public at a ASUC, Associated Students of the University of California, Berkeley, meeting, debating a divestment issue, BDS, we call it, not bondage and discipline. He called Israel's effective airline security procedures racism. When I pointed out that these security procedures might save his life someday, he said, "I don't care." This is what I heard someone call Jewicide. The embedded agenda trumps the facts. Yet he has been able to indoctrinate several generations of students now. In academia, there are a lot more like him, Jews and non-Jews. I feel threatened by this kind of thinking. I feel personally threatened. It has stirred up my survival instincts. The Hamas Charter calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people and has done so all along. However, it did not impact me personally. It did not touch my fear level. But now I am more motivated than I ever have been in my life. I am now motivated to speak out, and I am impelled by a sense of insecurity, not only for Israel, but for America. After returning from Israel, I researched global jihad and the predicament Israel is really in. I have undergone a transformation. I have woken up my survival instincts, and I've woken up my appreciation too. I appreciate the life I have led in America because I have had a chance to have a life of such incredible freedom as a woman. I have been able to explore anywhere I wanted to. I've been able to create and be part of the most exploratory, creative, innovative, novel experiments in living and thinking. I've had freedom of choice. I never thought I would do this, but I stand on the street now with a pro-Israel group holding an Israeli and/or an American flag, to counter those demonstrating that anti-Zionism really is anti-Semitism, in case there was any doubt. The flotillistas shout ugly slogans at us. Go back to Auschwitz. And I've had Intifada, Intifada shouted right in my face, chanted by hundreds of demonstrators held back only by the goodwill of the police. This can really stimulate your survival instincts. In fact, I recommend this greatly. If you want to really wake up your whole being and not just have an intellectual experience. You can hear the shouts of from the river to the sea, meaning they don't want a two-state solution, they want it all. Here, K-bar, K-bar, a favorable reference to Muhammad's 7th century massacre of a tribe of Jews. The Hamasniks shout, smash the Jewish state, target all Jewish businesses, every Zionist is a target, bloodthirsty, monster, shame, shame, shame. Well, I'm not ashamed. The local flotilla leader, who lives right near us in El Cerrito, north of Berkeley, he's not worried about being indicted by the federal attorney for aiding a terrorist organization. He quite openly and flagrantly is soliciting funds for the next flotillas. And this doesn't seem to bother anyone I know either. The Jewish, non-Jewish, women, men. Hardcore pacifists are ready to overlook all facts on the ground. They do not want to believe that no matter what they say or do, they have deadly and determined enemies. Patiently, I explain why the Israelis got themselves in a position of needing to have a blockade, but there is no memory, even of the most recent history. I live in Berkeley, California, where I pioneered women's studies in 1970, enabled by a faculty advisor who, 40 years later, now signs petitions to boycott Israel. The topic of Jew hatred, of Israel and Jewish history did not arise for me until I researched and taught Jewish women's history in the early 1990s. I was part of a generational bubble. We could have these great lives of intercultural crossover, lives which explored our freedom. In the 1970s, I lived in a matriarchal village. Well, that's what I called it. I wrote a story called Matriarchal Village. No one else really called it that, actually, just me. It was in Eugene, Oregon. I was a wild woman of the Pacific Northwest. And let's see, we were against patriarchy, all patriarchies. By the 1980s, it seemed to me we had ceded our global vision to the larger left, no longer concerned with the fate of women in Islam. I started hearing condemnations of Israel with no mention of toxic patriarchies surrounding it. The original ideals of global sisterhood seemed to disintegrate into a shocking new rhetoric of blaming Israel. Of course, we were against war, all war. In the 1980s, our slogans merged with the larger anti-war left. Another world is possible. And the larger New Age spirituality movement. Be the change you want to see. We refuse to be enemies. There are no enemies anywhere. In Berkeley, there is no free speech if you speak outside the dominant paradigm. Noni Darwish, an ex-Muslim who was an Egyptian American, she wrote, Now They Call Me Infidel, and she wrote an expose of Sharia law called Cruel and Usual Punishment, which I recommend greatly because it really helped my overall mental concept. Came to speak at UC Berkeley campus. She was interrupted so intensely at her campus speech in Wheeler Hall that she had to leave the stage, speech unfinished, with inadequate security. Public education is not easy. Darwish has to live with a bodyguard and death threats. The women's movement in this country has drifted off the rails, not finding Israel perfect and not finding our own American relatives perfect. Some women in the movement started down a long, slippery slope that they thought they were climbing the high moral ground, shouting hypocrites, murderers at their own relatives and ancestors while claiming a universal identity. The blame Israel always for everything obsession picked up speed. The Israeli government, always held in contempt as dominated by right-wing militarists, instead of being perceived as led by duly elected leaders who were chosen as the best to maintain security. An old friend from our matriarchal village, we were in a women's writing group together for years, said to me recently, Israel has the most right-wing militarist government in its history. She always made huge, confident claims in a quiet, calm manner. I believed in her confidence, my friend of 35 years. I always craved her approval. And then suddenly I heard how ignorant and arrogant she sounded. I asked her, how would you feel if you and your extended family were targeted for mass extermination by the ideology of millions of people? She replied, first, I would have to ask myself if it was true. We could try to figure out how to know better what the truth is. What form does that target for death take? Tell me why you feel your life is in danger of death from those you know and are in physical proximity to. I've never been able to answer her. This is where our friendship has stopped. She said, maybe this seems like a stupid question. I'm asking it because we have to find solid ground to stand on before we get to the more difficult questions. So tell me if you feel this. She is a person I've shared my feelings with for 35 years, but I shut down. She refuses to read the sources that have convinced me of the nature of the anti-Semitism we are facing. Her continued obtuseness indicates to me she's an adherent who refuses to give credence to any development that does not fit the narrative to which she is committed. Okay, next case. A well-known visionary author and earth activist and Wicca leader in the Bay Area, nationally, goes on English language tours of Gaza. After I returned from Israel, I had questions for her, a Jewish witch tourist in Gaza. By email, I asked her if she could monitor Al Jazeera in Arabic. I asked if she would ask some questions suggested by Tawfiq Hamid, an ex-Muslim, to define radical political Islam. He asks Muslims and Muslim institutions to clearly, unambiguously, and publicly denounce fighting and killing Jews, calling Jews pigs and monkeys, killing apostates, beating and stoning women for any reason, and gay killing. Her response was to say that radical Judaism needed to denounce these concepts also. Then she rattled off a list of horrendous things that Israeli soldiers and settlers have allegedly done to Palestinians. She signed it, Time, your radical consciousness and lifelong commitment to justice is better than this. Love. She signed it, love. As she shifted the blame, as she changed the subject and shifted the blame back to the Jews. A couple of weeks later, she sent me a forwarded message introduced by saying, this is a far more eloquent response to your questions than anything I could write, and then in caps, worth your time to read. But it was not a reference to my questions, but a total blaming of Muslim women's predicament on on Israel and Western imperialism, of course. Nothing about the inculcated Jew hatred. I responded by asking her again if she could monitor Al Jazeera in Arabic, but it was useless because she had blocked my email, and I was totally shocked because no more dialogue was possible. And no one had ever blocked my email before. There are familiar patterns, blaming everything on US imperialism, colonialism, blaming Israel and Jews right back into that familiar groove. Yes, and blaming everything on patriarchy, all patriarchies, not differentiating. A goddess priestess, this is case number 3. A goddess priestess who produces a very well distributed, very successful women's astrological calendar, mentored me in the 1970s. She is the voice of the old anti-patriarchal spirit. When I tried to tell her, I tried to update her, tell her what's happening in the world today, she wrote about the alternative, non-patriarchal world we are creating, without men who are so much more stuck in the old adversarial ways of patriarchy. I noticed the we of it, the world we are creating, because, of course, we do create our own reality, right? But then she updates herself and writes that getting beyond duality is the only game she wants to play. We all need to grow up and take responsibility for our lives. We need to fight the enemy within as a necessary precondition to fighting what appears to be enemies out there. This is a time of human evolution that will either do us in or force us to change in fundamental ways. She is envisioning the shift that the bumper stickers proclaim, the shift that happens. I imagine the shift also. I imagine that our survival instinct gets stimulated. It wakes up. That we come to appreciate our deepest, most important values and are inspired to defend them. The shift will entail, the motivation will entail feeling personally threatened, as far as I can tell. Now I am a Zionist street warrior. I stand with us. Every week we stand across the street in Oakland. We stand across the street from women in black holding Israeli and American flags. Standing next to me on the street was a lesbian who had also been in the Jewish feminist movement. We knew the same names, the local and national celebrities of our literary subculture of the 1970s. We had read the same authors, gone to the same concerts. We came from old lefty families. We know the righteous proclaimers who sign all the local anti-Israel BDS petitions. We are Jews and we support divesting, this kind of thing. But what do they know about Jewish history? The patterns, the repeating patterns. When a petition finally appeared with a long list of those opposed to the hate and lies of the Jewish state, I did not know any of those people, but I had to find them. I had to meet them. I really needed them. I will meet with anyone who supports the Jewish state of Israel. I am not afraid anymore of this surreal situation of being called being called right-wing, even though it is a total obfuscation of the term. Right-wing, racist, Islamophobic are words being used to frighten and suppress people with legitimate concerns. I am not drinking the Kool-Aid. I say, hello Berkeley, your acid-sparkled streets, heartland in the production of rhetoric, heartland of resistance. I'm here. I love Israel. I love America. Get used to it.